My daughter smiled like she was about to tell me something good, like maybe she got a promotion at work or had some exciting life news to share. Instead, she slid an envelope across the table and said the words that would shift everything inside me. "I have a surprise for you." I opened it, and there it was. A neatly typed statement of debt, her name at the top, $400,000 staring back at me in bold numbers. She watched me with this strange mix of fear and expectation, as if she wanted me to be proud of her for coming clean. But all I felt was the ground giving way. My hands tightened around the paper, and I couldn't even form a question at first, my mouth dry and my chest feeling like someone had punched a hole in it. $400,000 wasn't just a mistake, it was a lifetime of chains. And she had dragged it right to me, thinking maybe I would help, maybe I would carry it. I asked her how. Not angrily, not yelling, but with a tone that scared even me because it sounded so hollow, like my voice had been drained of anything human. She started rambling about opportunities, about investments, about how she thought she was being smart, that someone promised her big returns, that she could double her money in a year. I could see in her eyes she still wanted to believe it hadn't been her fault, that the people she trusted were the ones to blame. But the truth didn't matter. What mattered was she signed her name, she borrowed the money, and now it was sitting in my lap as if it belonged to me. She said she didn't know who else to turn to, that I was her father, that family meant helping each other when no one else would. I wanted to slam my fist on the table, to ask her where she was when I was breaking my back to keep food on it, where she was when I begged her to stop spending on things she didn't need, when I told her that shortcuts always come with a price. Instead, I sat there staring at the numbers, each zero pressing down heavier than the last. My mind started breaking it apart automatically, what 400,000 means in years, in sweat, in hours of labor, in lost freedom. She was still talking, her words pouring over me like water that couldn't wash away the stain of this decision. She said she thought maybe I could help her restructure it, maybe use my name, maybe sell something, maybe talk to someone who could make it disappear. That word, disappear, was the spark that lit the anger in me. Nothing disappears. Every action has a cost. Every lie has a shadow. Every choice leaves scars. She didn't want responsibility, she wanted escape, and she wanted to use me as her way out. I leaned back in my chair and looked at her, really looked. This was the girl I raised, the one I carried on my shoulders when she was small, the one I stayed up with through sick nights, the one I thought I taught better than this. And yet here she was, grown and desperate, holding a knife to my throat in the form of debt. I asked her what she expected me to do, and she didn't even hesitate. She wanted me to fix it. That's what she said, fix it, as if my entire life's worth was being measured in how well I could clean up the disaster she created. Something snapped inside me then. I realized this wasn't just about numbers on a page. This was about respect, about everything I had given and how little it meant to her. I told her I wouldn't cover it. I said it plain, with no hesitation, and I watched her face crumble. She started begging, voice breaking, tears forming like that would change the weight of her choices, but I was past that. A father's love has limits, and she had just walked me to mine. I folded the paper back into the envelope, slid it across the table, and told her she needed to figure it out on her own. She called me cruel, heartless, said I was abandoning her when she needed me most. But what she couldn't see was that she had already abandoned me the moment she decided to gamble her future without a thought of what it could cost the people who loved her. As she stormed out, leaving the envelope on the table like a curse, I felt a dark seed settle inside me, Not just anger, not just disappointment. Something sharper. A need to make sure she understood that debts like these don't just vanish. That choices like hers cut deeper than money. I didn't know it yet, but in that moment, the idea of revenge started to breathe. This wasn't going to end with me carrying her burden. No, this was going to end with her learning exactly what it means to betray the hand that fed you. When she left that night, the house felt different, heavier, like her debt had seeped into the walls and was waiting for me in every corner. The envelope sat there on the table, mocking me, daring me to pick it up again. I didn't touch it. I sat in silence until the sky outside turned black, and I knew that if I didn't take control of this, it would drown me too. She wanted me to fix her mess, but what she didn't realize was that I wasn't the same man who used to bend over backwards for her. I had spent decades cleaning up after everyone else, giving, sacrificing, watching my own life shrink while theirs expanded. This time, I wouldn't be the savior. This time, I would be the storm. I started digging, not into my bank account, but into hers. I knew her habits, her weaknesses, the way she never read the fine print, the way she trusted people who smiled too easily. I went through old emails, text messages, the scraps of information she'd left behind over the years when she used my computer or forgot to log out of accounts. It didn't take long before I found names. 2 men, 1 woman. People who had convinced her to invest. Promises of quick returns, luxury trips, freedom from the grind. They had dangled wealth in front of her, and she had bitten without hesitation. My stomach twisted, not just with anger at her, but with something darker toward them. They didn't just steal her money, they stole her sense of consequence. And now she thought I would bleed myself dry to clean up what they started. I didn't tell her what I was doing. She kept calling, leaving messages that swung between apologies and accusations, but I ignored them. I had no interest in words anymore. I wanted results. I found out one of the men owned a small real estate firm. On paper, it looked legitimate, but 1 layer down, it was nothing but a shell, a place to funnel money. Another ran a string of online consulting companies, flashy websites with testimonials that smelled like lies. The woman was their bridge. She organized events, networked, pulled in young people like my daughter with promises of financial freedom. It was a machine built to bleed the desperate, and my daughter had been their perfect victim. But here's the thing. They thought they were untouchable, and that made them sloppy. I knew a guy from years back, someone who owed me a favor, the kind of favor you don't forget. He had skills, digital ones. I handed him the names, the companies, the accounts. Within days, he had dug up enough dirt to bury them all. Fraud, tax evasion, hidden assets, offshore accounts that weren't as invisible as they believed. I stared at the files he sent me and felt that seed of revenge growing. My daughter thought I would save her by paying off her debt, but I had something better in mind. I was going to dismantle the people who created it, and I was going to make her watch. Still, there was a part of me that wanted her to feel the weight too. If I just erased the problem, she'd learn nothing. So I decided the first step wasn't destroying them, it was letting her drown a little. I told her to meet me. She arrived nervous, hopeful, like maybe I had changed my mind. She asked if I had spoken to the bank, if I had a plan to take a loan, if I would mortgage the house. I watched her face as I told her no, that she was on her own. She broke down again, said I didn't understand, said people were pressuring her, that she could lose everything. I let her cry. Then I told her about the names I found, the people behind it. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw it. That flicker of shame, that realization that she wasn't just unlucky, she had been stupid. I told her she had a choice. Either she helps me bring them down, or she can sink alone. She didn't answer right away. She hated me in that moment. I could see it. hated me for not giving in, for not being the father who bails her out. But she also knew she had nowhere else to go. Finally, she nodded, quietly, like a child caught stealing. That was all I needed. As she walked out that night, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The path was clear now. I wasn't going to be her safety net. I was going to be her teacher, and the lesson would be written in blood, money, and ruin. She thought handing me an envelope would make me her savior. What she didn't realize was that she had just handed me a weapon. I made the next stage a lesson that hurt in ways money alone never could. She would learn to reckon with consequence and not expect my hands to smooth every rough edge. I told her bluntly that apologies would not reopen doors, and that remorse would not repay strangers. So if she wanted any hope of repair, she had to do the work that comes after denial. We spent a week assembling proof. Emails she had written with hopeful phrases, screenshots of glossy promises, names on contracts she'd signed without a lawyer's glance, until her digital life looked like a map of how she'd been led. She screamed at me the first evening, accused me of humiliating her, but when I made her call the seminar organizer and play the recording back to herself, she heard the word she had trusted, and the lie sounded like a stranger's voice. That moment when a person hears their own gullibility laid out plainly is a dangerous thing. It makes you small, and when you are small, you stop protecting lies. I hired people who knew money's pathways better than the men who had lured her. They traced transfers through accounts in 3 states, through companies whose only business was passing cash along, and into a series of neat withdrawals to the very people who promised wealth. The accountants wrote reports that read like indictments, and the lawyers read those reports until the sentences on their pages stopped being abstractions and became weapons. Banks moved first. They froze accounts, flagged transactions, and sent official letters that carried the weight of consequence. The organizers who had laughed about passive income in front of brunch tables found their reputations peeling away under the hum of compliance officers and auditors. I didn't celebrate when one of them canceled a speaking tour because it meant another human having their life dismantled, but I also understood that they had built their game on other people's desperation and that games have to end. I reached out to a journalist I knew, a woman who took pleasure in exposing schemes dressed as opportunity, and I handed her the dossier with a note, "Don't sanitize their language." She wrote a piece that named names and followed timelines. It made the organizers' promises look absurd in daylight and forced some of their small-time backers to face the mess they had helped create. My daughter read that article before I showed it to her, and something like shame and relief and fury passed across her face. She had wanted secrecy, yet secrecy was what allowed predators to fan their nets. The legal notices began to arrive like quiet thunder. Cease and desists, subpoenas, requests for records, and I watched the men who taught her to trust charm suddenly become very careful with their words. All the while, I made sure my daughter could not hide behind grief. She had to answer emails to angry investors. She had to sit in rooms with lawyers and explain, without flinching, what she had promised and where the money had gone. She lost friends who were enamored with the glitter of quick returns. She lost a freelance contract when a client received a leak tying her name to the scandal. Those losses were hard and necessary. I could have stepped in and used old favors to smooth everything, paid debts, signed my name on papers, given people the easy out, but doing that would have preserved her habit of handing problems to whoever stood nearest. Instead, I forced accountability into her hands until it was something she could no longer avoid. There were ugly choices along the way. I slipped a copy of one particularly damning email to a creditor who hadn't been told the whole story, and they moved to reclaim funds faster than the organizers expected. I made passing calls to former associates of the seminar circuit and suggested cooperation with investigators in exchange for immunity. A few of them turned, driven by fear more than ethics, and their testimony made the investigators hungry. I am not proud of every strike I made. Some felt like petty vengeance, small, satisfying cuts instead of the clean work of law. But the architect of this had to feel the unraveling, and watching them sprint to patch holes they themselves had cut was instructive in a way my lectures never were. My daughter's voice changed during this stretch. Where early on it had been frantic and pleading, by the time depositions and interviews began, it had taken on something steadier, an ownership that did not excuse but did accept responsibility. She wrote long emails to people she had introduced to the program, offering what restitution could be coordinating lists of who might qualify for recovery, explaining in blunt terms that too much of what had been sold to them was fiction. The first time she sat across from an investor and said, without a tremor, "I am sorry. Here is what we can try to recover," I felt an odd, sharp thing tighten in my chest. Relief, maybe, or the recognition that redemption looks more like labor than like tears. Revenge had been my first impulse, and it still tasted like coal some days. But as the machines we set in motion chewed through fake corporations and empty promises, I began to notice that the deeper goal was not just punishment. It was rebuilding a person who had been willing to gamble away other people's security for the chance of something dazzling. Night after night, she sat with spreadsheets and cold calls and legal forms until the lines between her shame and her work blurred. She stopped asking me to fix what she broke and started asking, in a voice that used to beg and now simply inquired, what the next step should be. I gave her tools and kept my counsel. I watched her grow angrier and quieter and then pragmatic. Anger sharpened into focus, and quiet became the steady work of someone trying to put things right. By the time the first organizer faced a formal inquiry and the first civil suit was filed, the envelope with $400,000 sat in a drawer, its numbers unchanged, but no longer a lever to pull me into a habit of saving her from herself. She had been forced to feel the weight she had created, and she had begun to carry it. The civil suit cracked everything open wider than I expected, because once one victim stepped forward, the rest smelled blood and came with their own stories, their own numbers, their own shame turned into rage, and suddenly the three smiling predators who had charmed their way into hundreds of homes were standing knee-deep in paperwork they couldn't charm away. I sat in the back of one preliminary hearing. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see their faces when the judge read the words fraud, misrepresentation, restitution, and they twitched like animals caught in a trap that had been invisible until it snapped shut. My daughter sat beside me, pale, her hands tight together in her lap, and I could feel her pulse in the way she tapped her heel against the tile, not out of nervousness, but out of recognition. This was the wreckage of her choices, and she was being forced to sit with it, not hide from it. At night she came to me with updates, not excuses. She told me how creditors snarled down the phone line, how old friends she had coaxed into investing now spit her name with contempt, how she was learning the difference between desperation and greed. For the first time in years, she asked for nothing other than guidance. That surprised me more than the lawsuits. She asked how to answer questions without flinching, how to read contracts without being blinded by promises, how to know when someone's smile was a mask. I didn't coddle her. I gave her the same blunt truth I'd given myself for decades. No one rescues you. You claw your way out, or you stay buried. The predators began to collapse under the weight of what I'd fed into the system. One had a house seized, another's passport flagged, and the woman, the bridge, the one who lured them in with glittering promises, lost the very network she had lived on. She tried to rebrand, to distance herself, but the internet doesn't forgive, and the article we'd seeded kept climbing searches, her name forever tied to words like scam and fraud. My daughter read every comment under that article, hundreds of strangers spitting fury. And she cried not because they were cruel, but because she saw her reflection in their anger. She wasn't innocent anymore. She wasn't naive. She was a participant in something ugly, and the mirror cut her. But revenge wasn't finished. I wanted her to rebuild on scar tissue, not soft ground. I contacted a few people she owed directly, people who were ready to sue her personally, and instead of shielding her, I arranged meetings. She had to face them, look into the eyes of people who had trusted her. Some spat in her face metaphorically, some threatened legal action, some just looked disappointed, and each one left its mark deeper than any punishment I could invent. She started selling off the things she once bragged about, the designer handbags, the gadgets, the furniture she claimed were investments in her lifestyle. Watching her box them up and list them online was more satisfying than I expected, because it wasn't me doing it, it was her, piece by piece dismantling the illusion she had bought into. I knew she was changing when she called one night, her voice steady, and told me she had refused an offer from some new mentor who promised quick income in exchange for a fee. She told him flatly she'd rather scrub floors than fall for another scheme. That's when I realized revenge had taken on another shape. It wasn't just about destroying the ones who tricked her. It was about cutting out the part of her that made her easy prey. And slowly, painfully, it was working. The lawsuits dragged on, months of discovery, filings, hearings, but each one chipped away at the predators until they weren't symbols of success anymore. They were cautionary tales. When the first judgment landed, forcing them to pay restitution to the victims, my daughter looked at me with eyes I hadn't seen since she was a child, eyes that held both relief and exhaustion. She whispered that maybe she could breathe again, but I reminded her breathing doesn't erase scars, it just means you're still alive to feel them. I never paid a cent of her debt. Instead, I turned it into a battlefield where she had to fight, bleed, and crawl her way through consequence. And in doing so, she became harder, sharper. Not the careless girl who slid an envelope across my table, but someone who finally understood what it costs when you gamble with more than just your own future. The judgment didn't end things. It only lit the next fire, because once restitution was ordered, the scavengers came out. Lawyers circling, debt collectors sharpening their teeth, and my daughter finally realized that even when predators fall, the victims still bleed for years. She was one of those victims, but she was also a carrier of the disease. Her signature had brought others into the fold. Her enthusiasm had convinced friends. And now she was paying the price in a currency heavier than dollars. She lost her apartment first. The lease was revoked when her name showed up in the news tied to fraud hearings. She moved back into my house, not as the daughter who once demanded freedom, but as someone stripped down, carrying plastic bins instead of dreams. I didn't welcome her with warmth. I told her she could stay, but she would earn her space by working, by contributing, by facing every creditor who came knocking. She got a job that embarrassed her, a low-paying clerk position where she filed papers for people who looked at her like she was invisible. She used to mock jobs like that, calling them soul-crushing, but now she took the hours without complaint, because every paycheck mattered. She came home tired, shoulders bent, but instead of whining, she spread her bills out on the table and calculated what could be paid. I watched her sell jewelry she once bragged about, watched her cut up cards that had been her lifeline to delusion, and for the first time, I felt something close to respect stirring inside me again. Meanwhile, I wasn't finished with the architects of this collapse. I had planted seeds in places they couldn't see, and those seeds were bearing fruit. A tax investigation swallowed one of them whole. His offshore accounts became evidence, his polished smile gone when photos of him leaving court in handcuffs hit the news. Another tried to pivot into crypto schemes, but the journalist I had fed turned her teeth on him again, exposing the recycled promises before they could spread. The woman, the bridge, was ruined socially. Her network exiled her. Her speaking engagements vanished. and she tried to reach out to my daughter in secret, begging for help, claiming she too was a victim. My daughter showed me the message, hands shaking, and I told her to delete it. There is no sympathy for spiders when the web burns. She began to understand what revenge really meant. It wasn't just watching enemies fall. It was living with the knowledge that your own weakness gave them power. She took that knowledge and started volunteering at a local group that helped people escape debt traps. At first, she went to fill hours, but soon she was standing in front of strangers, telling her story, her voice trembling but true. People listened. Some judged her, others nodded in quiet recognition, but every time she spoke, I saw the chain of shame loosen just a little. I never told her this, but I kept copies of all the lawsuits, the articles, the financial records. I kept them not because I wanted to revisit the pain, but because I wanted her to never forget. One night she caught me looking at them and asked why I couldn't just let it go now that she was changing. I told her the truth. Forgetting is a luxury, and scars are reminders. She nodded, not fighting me, because she knew by then that comfort was the enemy of growth. By the end of that year, the $400,000 had shrunk, not vanished, but reduced through settlements, partial recoveries, and the slow grind of her paychecks. She still owed more than she could handle, but the number was no longer a death sentence. It was a burden she carried with eyes wide open. And the predators? They were shells of themselves. One bankrupt, one imprisoned, one vanished into obscurity, their empire of lies dismantled. I sat across from her one evening, the same table where she had once slid that envelope toward me, and I asked her if she understood now why I hadn't saved her. She looked me straight in the eyes and said yes, and for the first time in years, I believed her. The revenge I had craved at the beginning had twisted into something more complicated. It wasn't just about destroying them. It was about forging her into someone who could never be destroyed that way again. The final piece of this story didn't come with a gavel or a bank notice. It came in silence one night when my daughter handed me another envelope. The same gesture that had begun all of this, but her hands weren't trembling and her eyes weren't begging. They were steady. Inside wasn't a bill or a demand. It was a record of payments she had made. Every installment lined out, every cent accounted for. And at the bottom, a number that showed the debt, once 400,000, now nearly extinguished. Not gone, not yet, but something she had crushed down to size with her own labor. She didn't ask me to look it over. She didn't ask for praise. She just set it there like proof of who she had become. For the first time, I realized she no longer carried that debt like a chain, but like armor, heavy, but hers. She worked 2 jobs by then, clerking by day, delivering packages by night, saving every dollar. The girl who once bragged about vacations and expensive handbags now wore the same jacket until the sleeves frayed, and she didn't care. She had friends again, not the shallow ones who loved her illusions, but a handful of people from the debt support group who knew exactly what it meant to live scarred and still push forward. She no longer introduced herself with shame. She told the truth flatly, that she had been scammed, that she had scammed others in turn by convincing them to join, and that she was paying the price until the very last dollar was gone. Strangers respected her more for that honesty than they ever did for the lies she once sold. The predators were gone by then. One rotted in prison, another vanished overseas, chased by creditors, and the woman who once lured my daughter into the trap was reduced to selling cheap self-help books online under a fake name, her face unrecognizable behind filters. I thought I would feel triumph at their downfall, but what I felt instead was emptiness, as if revenge had been a fire that burned hot but left behind only ash. What filled that space wasn't victory. It was the sight of my daughter clawing her way back to dignity, something no courtroom could deliver. We sat together at the same table where this story started, and she asked me the question I had known was coming. Did I hate her for what she had done? I told her the truth. I said I had hated what she became. I had hated the weakness and the arrogance and the way she had treated me like a safety net. But hate wasn't where it ended. I told her that making her fight alone, forcing her to crawl through the mud of consequence, was the only way she could ever become someone I could respect again. She didn't cry. She nodded, and for once, silence between us felt like peace, not distance. The envelope still sat on the table, but it no longer mocked me, no longer cursed me. It was just paper now, a record of war and survival. My daughter left that night not as the reckless girl who once thought money could be conjured from thin air, but as someone hardened, scarred, and real. She had learned the lesson no parent wants to teach, but every child must learn. No one will save you from yourself, and if you dare hand your ruin to another, they might just hand it back sharper than before. That was my revenge. Not the fall of 3 con artists, not the freezing of accounts or the lawsuits or the headlines. My revenge was giving her the chance to suffer, to rebuild, and to rise into someone who will never again look at me with the expectation of rescue. She handed me an envelope with a $400,000 debt. I handed her back a life rebuilt from the ashes of it.